Russia has built a shadow fleet estimated to involve more than 600 vessels, all to allow the most sanctioned country on Earth to overcome some of the world's strictest sanctions. Sanctions which haven't stopped Russia's economy growing at a faster rate than every single G7 country since the outbreak of the war, at least according to the IMF. The question, though, is how? How is Russia playing the greatest game of cat and mouse with the West? Shadow fleets of oil alone don't explain this. This involves illicit gold, rising superpowers, Iranian gas deals, and the Mongolian flag. To get to the bottom of this, we need to ask some questions. Were the assumptions around sanctions just plain wrong? When sanctions first hit Russia, economists and think tanks were coming out with all sorts of wild predictions. The International Institute for Finance thought its GDP would fall by 15%, when in reality, Russia's GDP fell by only 1.2%. At least officially. According to the IMF, that is. Who themselves have had a less than great track record, forecasting Russia's GDP would fall by 8.5% in 2022 and then 2.3% in 2023, whilst in reality, the agency itself reported Russia's growth of more than 3.5% in 2023 alone. In fairness to these global economists, though, on paper, dire economic predictions didn't seem like such a stretch. After all, the sanctions targeted key sources of Russian revenue for the state. Companies were banned from trading technology with Russia, the assets of oligarchs like Chelsea Football Club were frozen, Russian banks were banned from the international financial system, its international sovereign wealth fund of more than $300 billion was frozen, and Russia's energy exports were banned in places like the US. The problem with all this, though, was that many experts and politicians overestimated the power of sanctions. As one analyst put it, people created a fairy tale that the entire Russian economy was state-run, which is only a half-truth. In reality, the Russian economy wasn't like the old USSR, where absolutely everything was controlled by the state. It had gotten used to decades of instability and shocks, from the collapse of communism in the late 80s, the wild west of privatization in the 90s, all the way through to the sanctions after annexing Crimea in 2014. Basically, the economy had reached an equilibrium through disequilibrium, functioning in a state of instability which was totally alien to many Western advisors sitting behind their desks, and in the process becoming very good at finding loopholes. Perhaps the best example of this is shown by the sanctions on the oligarchs, the richest men and women in Russia. A lot of press was made about sanctions on them in the early days of the war, but there was a fundamental flaw. By and large, sanctions on oligarchs were left up to individual member states, meaning that whilst one country or state confiscated assets, an oligarch could still be free to enjoy a billionaire lifestyle in another unsanctioned state elsewhere. Also, a lot of their assets were only frozen, as opposed to being gainfully redeployed, resulting in billions of dollars worth of mansions, yachts, and supercars just sitting in a state of limbo. Hardly a success. Not to mention that the sanctions didn't really aggressively go for the economic Achilles heel of the Russian economy, its energy sector. When the former US presidential hopeful John McCain said Russia was a gas station pretending to be a country, he wasn't wrong. If we look at the share of the Russian budget coming from oil and gas revenues, it has consistently provided between half to a third of all tax revenue. As a single sector, this represents a massive target for sanctions. Despite this, Europe's dependency on Russian energy meant that in the first year of Russia's three-day special operation, the EU paid almost 140 billion euros to Russia in fossil fuels, mainly at sky-high prices in the first half of 2022. It wasn't until the very end of 2022 that the EU blocked the maritime transport of Russian oil, giving Russia vital time to find alternative markets and make huge profits. How much profit? Well, if we look at how much of the total revenues Russia receives is required to balance its state budget, the difference between the two is a rough indicator of its profit. We can see that despite sanctions, 2022 was by far the most profitable year. This ability to make obscene profits was largely due to how slow sanctions took to come into effect, if at all. Since then, profits have fallen, suggesting sanctions are slowly working at face value, but that's something we'll pick up on later. For now, though, it's worth highlighting a crucial distinction in Russia's valuable energy sector: how Russia benefits differently from its oil and gas. Oil exports matter because of money, whereas gas exports matter because of influence. Looking at this chart of Russian state revenue, shows that the vast majority of Russia's natural resource wealth comes from its oil, not from its gas. Oil is quite literally a lot more fluid. It doesn't require large pipe networks or expensive supercooling to move around. Meaning that if one market gets cut off, which is exactly what happened, it's easy to redirect it to another one. And it's this ease of movement that explains how Russia has been able to almost entirely replace its supply of oil to Europe with supply to India, who, like any other consumer, were more than happy to purchase oil at a discount, just as prices went through the roof. Gas, on the other hand, requires a lot of infrastructure, which is incredibly hard to replace overnight. Despite pipelines like the Nord Stream and Yamal no longer being in operation, 2 years after the war began, gas is still being pumped into Europe through the Brotherhood-Soyuz Turk Stream pipelines. Even based on the EU's own timeline, the bloc will still be importing Russian gas until 2027, a whole 5 years after sanctions began. In fact, one type of gas import has actually increased since sanctions began: liquid natural gas, otherwise known as LNG. Comparing the year before and after sanctions, not only have Russian LNG exports increased globally, but the share made up by the EU has also risen. Ironically, this is a direct result of the reduction in pipeline gas from Russia, as Europe has diversified its LNG supply through places like the US and Qatar. In doing so, some companies have exploited a loophole through enabling the transshipment of Russian LNG. These are mainly for export out of Europe and not for domestic consumption, but nonetheless have enabled European and Russian companies to profit in the process. Currently, there are 7 major LNG facilities either operating, under construction, or proposed in Russia. Together, they're part of Russia's plan to increase LNG exports to 100 million tons by 2030. Comparing that to current export capacity, this would make Russia the world's largest LNG exporter. And at the forefront of this energy pivot is the Arctic LNG 2, a $25 billion operation located along the icy Kara Sea in the far north of Russia. However, due to the unique nature of the LNG market, Western nations have been able to use secondary sanctions to deter most international companies. The key reason for this is LNG's requirement for sub-zero temperatures to stay liquid, resulting in LNG requiring special tankers for transport. Unfortunately for Russia, there are only 700 LNG tankers worldwide, compared to 7,500 oil tankers. This makes them a lot easier to track and sanction, particularly the even smaller number of suitable icebreaker-class LNG tankers required to transport LNG from Arctic ports. Nonetheless, Russia has other ways to continue trading gas. One such creative example is the Iran-Russia gas swap, which involves offsetting supplies to each country for export to third parties. Here's how it works. Iran and Russia both have large quantities of natural gas. For Iran, most of this natural gas is located in the south. If it were to directly swap gas with Russia, it would first need to transport it north, through heavily populated and mountainous terrain. As Russia and Iran don't share a land border, it would then need to transfer it across either Turkmenistan and Kazakhstan in the east, or Azerbaijan in the west. However, by reversing existing gas pipelines which already flow through underutilized pipelines in Turkmenistan, it can buy discounted Russian gas and sell it cheaply to its population centers in the north of the country, while simultaneously using its own gas in the south for export to more lucrative international markets. Meaning Iran buys cheap Russian gas for domestic consumption and sells its own gas internationally for a higher price, with the added benefit of earning much-needed foreign currency. As both countries are under various international sanctions, this makes them natural allies, providing Russia with a textbook on how to address sanctions. The key difference between Iran's and Russia's sanctions, though, is that Iran's were meant to cut it off from international trade, whilst Russia's were meant to still allow international trade just as long as it didn't inconvenience Western industries in the process. The best example of this is the energy price cap introduced by sanctioning countries at the end of 2022. The idea being to allow Russian oil to be traded provided it was sold under $60 per barrel. At this price point, it was meant to maintain global supply, limiting the disruption to the global economy, but simultaneously cap Russia's ability to make large profits on its oil revenues in the process. Which is all well and good until you realize that Russian oil is reportedly trading for more than the price cap itself, enabling them to make larger profits than the price cap intended. So, how did Russia beat the price cap? Well, that's because the price cap relies on the global trade in oil using G7 insurance. You see, whilst the world's oil supply may be dominated by OPEC member countries, to get oil to its final destination requires transport using the world's fleet of oil tankers. A transport task with a certain level of risk for costly oil spills, fires, or delays. To mitigate this, the world's oil tankers utilize insurance and brokerage services which are dominated by G7 insurance companies, who cover 87% of the world's total shipping by tonnage. And that's why by preventing Russian oil from using insurance unless it trades under the $60 price cap, the idea was to cap its ability to make profits. But according to the Wall Street Journal, Russia now uses hundreds of aging oil tankers which don't rely on G7 insurance companies to move most of its oil, otherwise known as the Russian shadow fleet, totally undermining the price cap. So effective has this shadow fleet been that Russian oil has even found its way into the US Pentagon supply chain. This occurred in Greece, where unrefined Russian oil ended up in Turkish storage before being sold to a Greek refinery, where finally it was sold to the US military. To counter this growing shadow fleet problem, the US sanctioned Russia's largest shipping company. But being one step ahead, most of the company's tankers had already been transferred to offshore companies in politically neutral countries with very high secrecy laws. This explains why Mongolia, a landlocked nation more than 400 miles from the nearest ocean, has become a popular flag to register ships under, a country which conveniently has relaxed secrecy laws and also borders Russia. In fact, cross-border trade with Russia, not just in Mongolia but across Central Asia, has seen a remarkable uplift in trade since sanctions began. Whilst exports to Russia of high-tech goods from the European Union have collapsed, almost every single EU country's exports to Central Asia have gone through the roof, according to data analysed by the Washington Post. By making a not-so-wild assumption that most of these goods ended up travelling onto Russia, this would largely offset Europe's direct trade embargo with Russia. To try to prevent this trade, Western banks closely monitor transactions in euros and dollars, threatening secondary sanctions on any banks which use dollars or euros to trade with Russia. But yet again, Russia has found a loophole. To get around this, Russia has turned to gold, a long-favoured alternative means of exchange for countries looking to circumvent sanctions. A tried and tested means that even Iran has used in the past in exchange for oil. With one of the highest gold production rates in the world, Russia is perfectly positioned to take advantage of illicit gold deals to avoid sanctions. According to international gold rules, refineries are permitted to list intermediary countries such as Dubai, India, or China as the source of their gold, provided the gold arrives unrefined. This way, Russia can effectively trade unrefined gold with these countries in exchange for goods and services. However, even this is still impractical on a large scale, as most businesses simply don't want tons of gold which is hard to store, move around, and trade on a day-to-day basis. So, to help mitigate this, Russia has massively increased the settlement and trade in its own currency or other currencies that it deems friendly, whilst also reducing the trade in currencies it deems unfriendly. The main advantage here is that by avoiding the dollar or the euro, these trades can be completely hidden from sanctioning countries, with very little they can do about it, being much harder for US or European banks to track trades which don't involve their currencies. With this advantage going a long way to explaining why China's currency has doubled to make up almost 60% of Russia's sovereign wealth fund. In fact, China is often seen as a key part of Russia's pivot away from Europe, with trade between the two countries skyrocketing since 2022. But this may not be as good as it seems, at least for Russia. Is China actually saving Russia? To provide some context on the scale of Russia's trade with China, Chinese companies export more to Vietnam than Russia, an economy a fraction of the size of Russia's and almost as much as the Netherlands, a country with a GDP less than half the size of Russia's. This suggests Chinese exporters may just be playing catch-up with Russia based on historically underdeveloped levels of exports. But what about China's imports, which provide Moscow with much-needed foreign currency? Well, if we look at China's largest trade deficits, Russia is included, but only ranks 9th, gaining $17 billion more than what it buys from China. And just like almost every other nation on the list, China's deficit with Russia is driven by natural resources, as opposed to high-productivity, value-add industries. Given the scale of the increase in trade between the two countries and how much China has helped offset Russia's lost oil and gas revenues with Europe, it's surprising the Chinese deficit, or Russia's surplus, depending on which way you look at it, is so low. A big reason for this is because China is actually doing Russia no favors, and by many reported accounts, is actually getting a bargain, saving a reported $10 billion on oil alone from trade-sanctioned countries like Iran and Russia. With trade heavily restricted from its traditional markets, China knows that Russia has few alternatives for selling massive quantities of oil and gas, giving it an extremely favorable trade advantage, one that is largely carried out in the Chinese yuan, a currency which, despite China's size, only accounts for an estimated 2% of all global transaction volumes. That's less than the Swiss franc or the Canadian or Australian dollars. For a very good reason. You see, most countries are extremely wary of what they see as perceived control of the yuan by the Chinese state itself. If Beijing has the ability to manipulate the value of the currency, then what looks like a safe investment now could end up being a lot less attractive in just a few months. By putting all its proverbial eggs in China's basket, this makes it incredibly difficult to remove its Chinese-denominated assets should China put capital controls in place. Nonetheless, playing around with money is not something unfamiliar to Russia either. How does Russia play with magic money? Even though Russia is under crippling sanctions, its supply of money is at an all-time high, far outpacing the G7, OECD, and the Euro area when measured by broad money, which includes not only currencies but deposits and money market funds. The obvious answer here would be because they're printing more money. But it's how they're funding this printing which is more interesting. One of the main ways they're funding this is through Russia's finance ministry. The ministry, which looks after the state budget, including its sovereign wealth fund, has been selling the Central Bank of Russia dollars and euros which they don't have, or to put it another way, don't have access to. You see, we mentioned earlier that Russia has an estimated $300 billion of frozen assets abroad, with no guarantee when, if ever, it will be able to access them. But this hasn't stopped the Russian government from artificially switching this out-of-reach currency to the bank's account and taking out rubles with it, increasing the money supply without any real transactions taking place. Imagine that. But where is this magic money being spent? Unsurprisingly, the number one destination is military spending. To help put this in context, national defense spending now accounts for more than 6% of Russia's GDP. Before the war, there were an estimated 2,000 military-industrial enterprises in Russia. Since the war, that number has risen to over 6,000, providing everything from tanks to planes to missiles for the Russian war machine, creating a secondary problem of who exactly is going to build all these fancy new pieces of kit. Collectively, these 6,000 enterprises employ an estimated 3.5 million people. Once you account for all those who fled Russia since the beginning of 2022 and have been drafted into national conscription, and it's no wonder that Russia is actually experiencing a labour shortage, with the inevitable outcome that the shortage of labour will drive up wages, which, considering most of defence spending stems back to the Russian state, will lead to siphoning off more money from its magic money tree or just other parts of the economy, creating an even more unbalanced economy in the process. A weird form of economic Dutch disease focusing more and more resources on a war which Russia has already spent so much more than money on. Now, if you've been watching the video this long, as a bonus you may have noticed an Easter egg somewhere in the video, providing a clue on the next topic. Let me know in the comments below if you can find it. Please also consider giving a like or subscribing, it really helps the channel grow. Until the next video, stay curious.